Ladies and gentlemen, this is TVP World. You're watching another edition of Break the Fake, where we debunk fake news and combat false narratives. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and let's get rolling. A video that captures the logic of today's Russia has gone viral on Russian social media. Residents of Engels, the same city from which Russian aircraft have been taking off for 4 years to bomb Ukrainian high-rise buildings, thermal power plants, and residential areas, they're now recording appeals to the authorities. The reason is brutally basic. There's no heating, no hot water, it's winter, it's freezing. Stairwells are decaying, pipes are rotten, boiler rooms are barely holding together. People are sitting in their apartments wrapped in layers, asking for attention, for actions, for not to be abandoned. Now, they're careful with their words, they're polite, they're almost grateful just to be speaking. Engels, a city that helps export destruction, cannot import heat into its own homes.
В данный момент я являюсь жителем города Энгельса по улице Тельмана, 13. У нас есть котельная, Волгоградский переулок 1. Котлы, которые по данному адресу, Волгоградский переулок 1, требуют ремонта, там должно работать 3 котла. Там в данный момент, я так думаю, вообще работает 1 котел. Сама внутри котельня находится в убитом состоянии. Туда бы явиться бы, наверное, Следственному комитету, провести проверку.
Я проживаю в этом доме 17 лет. Так как последние 2 года такой беды у нас ранее никогда не было. Трубы находятся, как уже сказали, в плачевном состоянии. Цена не соответствует качеству. То есть за любой товар, который мы оплачиваем, мы должны получить хорошее качество. Нам некуда просто обратиться. Я не знаю, какая-то в городе катастрофа, понимаете? Люди обращаются, там у нас, видите, какие активные. Они обращаются куда-то в администрацию.
Я хотела бы вас попросить о помощи, чтобы стабилизировалось у нас отопление, горячее водоснабжение по городу Энгельсу. Просим вас провести экспертизы состояния котельного оборудования и теплотрасс.
So Russia spends hundreds of millions of dollars on a single massive bombardment of Ukraine. Cruise missiles, drones, logistics, airfield maintenance, aviation, one strike, one bill. With that same money, Engels could replace its heating mains, repair boiler rooms, renovate the water supply, maybe even experience what functioning infrastructure feels like. But the money has already flown, literally. Missiles take off, radiators stay cold. What stands out most, by the way, is not only the damage, but the tone of the appeals. People do not ask why this is happening, they do not demand answers, they do not assign blame, they ask quietly, almost apologetically, as if warmth were a privilege, as if freezing were their own fault. And this is the Russian social contract in practice. The state owes you nothing, you owe it gratitude for listening. The video from Engels is not just viral content. It is a snapshot of how the system works. A city used as a launchpad for destroying other people's infrastructure cannot maintain its own. People freeze, stay loyal, and keep explaining why it is necessary. And the state, which demands sacrifice in the name of power, cannot be bothered with something as unambitious as heat. In today's Russia, missiles are guaranteed. Warmth, well, that's more optional. Russian civil aviation has reached a bold new level of customer service. In the Irkutsk region, passengers on a regular flight suddenly discovered they were not flying on a passenger AN-24, but on a cargo AN-26. No warning, no choice, and very fittingly, no illusions. Passengers, including children, were literally seated next to stacks of cargo. A true all-inclusive experience. And by all, we mean boxes, pallets, and a quiet realization that comfort was never part of the ticket. The airline naturally saw nothing unusual here. In a country where temporary solutions last for years, a passenger in a cargo compartment is but a system functioning exactly as designed. This episode is not a curiosity or some exotic feature of Siberian routes. It's a system of a deep structural crisis in Russian aviation. Sanctions have cut Russia off from Western spare parts, maintenance, and certified components, and their aircraft ages quicker than state-sanctioned optimism. The domestic production that was promised to get back on its feet is still unable to get off the runway. The new IL-114-300s, meant to replace their outdated fleet, are still not certified. Launch dates have been postponed so regularly that they now resemble a seasonal ritual rather than a plan. Even the Russian Federal Air Transport Agency admits the country could lose at least 339 aircraft over the next 5 years. And that does not include those still flying despite failing to meet 21st century aviation standards. The numbers speak for themselves. In 2025, the number of dangerous incidents involving aircraft in the Russian Federation increased fourfold. In other words, progress is being made, just not in a direction usually associated with flight safety. Passengers on cargo planes are not an exception or an error. They're a visual summary of how civil infrastructure decays under war, isolation, and a constant insistence that everything is absolutely under control. Russian propaganda has once again returned to its most reliable genre: atrocity committed by the armed forces of Ukraine. This time allegedly in the Kharkiv region. Yeah, we've all seen this movie before. A Ukrainian drone supposedly deliberately attacked a civilian vehicle carrying peaceful residents who were allegedly on their way to a hospital. Russian media are now circulating this story with heavy amplification, citing the so-called head of the Kupiansk district administration, a position that exists entirely within the same fictional universe as independent Russian media. 2 short videos on Telegram are offered as atmosphere. Context is optional and verification is unnecessary. The accusation arrives prepackaged.
У нас, к сожалению, сейчас нету дороги жизни. У нас любая дорога подвергается атакам. Это вот мы едем параллельно, буквально вот эта дорога, которая местные жители застряли, выталкивали машину. Вот видно впереди 3 толкало. Тут уже просто 2 человека. Одного в больницу оторвало, повезли. А 2 разорвало сразу, тела разорванные, видно. Дрон ударил прямо в ноги людям, прямо в ноги.
То есть они толкали машину, и он прямо по ним.
Да. Больше, чем 400 метров. 400 метров где-то, максимум 600, максимум. Километра нет.
Здесь они и погибли, да?
Да.
Такие вот мобилизованные, кого споймали, сбегали, их ловили и отправляли без учебки сразу в штурмовые бригады. У нас один пример, то, что они недалеко убежали, их сразу споймали. Там 2 человека, я их не знаю, то их сразу там по 15 броников на них накидали, побили и держали постоянно возле себя, инструктора под присмотром. А те, кто кто дальше убежал, уже дальше их споймали. Их отправили без учебки в штурмовые бригады.
And as usual, the Russian side provides no evidence, nada. The video contains no identifiable location, no confirmed timeline, no independent sources, no technical data. The only clearly visible elements is the absence of information. Everything rests on a statement from a representative of the occupation authorities. In other words, we said it, therefore it happened. Yes, this is not a mistake, it's a method. Emotional language, vague visuals, zero verification. The calculation is simple. Do not convince with facts, overwhelm with feeling, and move on before questions appear. Meanwhile, reality remains inconvenient. See, it is the Russian army that systematically shells civilian infrastructure in the Kharkiv region. Residential areas, hospitals, schools, energy facilities. These attacks have been recorded, confirmed, and documented by international organizations, journalists, and human rights activists. And against that background, stories about Ukrainian strikes on civilians are not reporting. There are damage control, and this is classic mirror accusation. Shift responsibility, blur accountability, accuse the victim of your own actions. The alleged attack on a civilian vehicle fits perfectly into this pattern. No evidence, no verification, just loud words, recycled faces from occupation administrations, and another attempt to replace documented crimes with a staged narrative. And with that, we conclude this edition of Break the Fake. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.